Before World War II began, some aviation experts claimed that the long-range bomber was the most advanced weapon in the world. They believed that bombers could wipe out cities and industries and destroy an enemy's desire and ability to go on fighting. Their theory was tested during World War II. From 1939 until 1941, the German Luftwaffe controlled the skies on each front. But in 1942, things began to change. Germany found itself engaged in a four-front aerial war over England, over North Africa, over the Soviet Union, and over Russia. The United States joined the air war against Germany in 1942. The American B-17 bomber carried a better bomb sight than the British planes. B-17s were known as flying fortresses because of their heavy armor and many guns, and they could take lots of punishment. For these reasons, the Americans favored pinpoint bombing of specific targets during the daytime rather than area bombing at night. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to operate in fleets, delivering massive knockout blows in daylight precision raids. The B-17's useful bomb load was somewhere in the region of 8,000 pounds for long-range missions. The other main heavy bomber of the B-17's vintage was the consolidated B-24 Liberator, a large, heavy four-engine machine. The B-17 or B-24 was hard to fly all aboard, and there was always the dread certainty that many would not be coming back. During 1943, losses were sometimes appalling. Losing 1 in every 10 planes was common. The chance of a crew hit hard 5 miles up was shaved very slim. Bombers died in many ways, sometimes in flames, sometimes in an instant when a bomb aboard the plane was hit and went off, or in a spiral when a wing or tail was destroyed. When hit, a plane had to drop its payload as close to the target as they could before ejecting. This is the crew of one such unlucky plane. Their B-17 was shot down over Germany, and some did not survive.
Hi, my name is Connie Peterson, and my dad was Second Lieutenant Robert Nixon Evans, born in August of 1915, and he was a World War II POW. In December of 1942, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, my dad enlisted in the United States Air Force. Soon, he was in basic and flying training school in Arizona. Orders came for him to fly in the European theater, and he became a member of the 8th Air Force. On his 8th mission over Europe, my grandparents received a dreadful telegram saying that he had been shot down and missing in action in Europe. This was in March of 1944. In April, almost a month later, they received another telegram saying the American Red Cross had seen him and that he was in a German POW camp. He was there until May of 1945. My dad went on to finish his enlistment and finally retired as a major in the United States Air Force Reserve in 1975. My dad flew a plane called a B-17 bomber, and I don't know how many people were exactly on the plane, probably 8, and the plane was shot down in a formation flight over Europe.
He was the pilot, and when he was shot down, it was kind of an interesting story. As they have rookie pilots come and join the formations way at the end would be the rookies, and where the guys at the very front would be the most experienced pilots. And the Germans had 2 fighters at that time that would be sent up to try to shoot down the bombers before they got to the location. One was a Messerschmitt, and one was a Fokker. And what they would do is they'd pick off the guys at the very end because there wasn't that many people shooting. So they'd come up from the side, and the goal was to shoot out the engines one at a time until the plane was finally disabled and shot down. So my dad, with 2 engines flying, he was still keeping up with the formation. But when the 3rd engine was shot down, he couldn't keep up, and it would decide that he would pull out and he would have to crash land his plane. At the time, 2 of his guys were injured, and actually one of them were dead on the plane. So they decided, rather than a group of parachuting out, that the whole team would crash land together as a group. So as they were coming down, before they landed, they found a little village just outside Berlin and bombed that. They dropped their payload, and they came in at tree level trying to look for a field. And just as they were scraping the tops of some trees, they found a field and they were able to land the plane.
On the way down, the story is that to make it a softer landing, because they were shot, that they skimmed the treetops and landed in a field.
And the team was shaken up at the time. They were captured at the time by a farmer that had a shotgun. They were injured, and at that time they were taken prisoner. He was in a prisoner of war camp for 14 months.
Most prisoners who survived the first days of captivity faced a long journey by foot, truck, train, or ship. Typical POW generally traveled from a temporary detention area near the battlefield to a permanent camp, usually in the captor's homeland. Newly taken prisoners, already weakened by hunger and disease, but even hungrier and sicker when their captors were unprepared to transport and feed large numbers of men. German and Soviet Union trains were used to carry POWs the vast distances between battlefield and permanent camps. Prisoners were stuffed into cattle cars with little food or water and no medical attention and no heat in winter. When one trainload of Germans arrived at a western Russia camp at Yelsburg on the Volga River, it held 700 frozen corpses, victims of typhus. When being transferred to Germany, some jumped off mid-trip trying to escape, or some say to die with dignity in open air rather than the disgusting train cars. New prisoners were a great source of information. Soon after surrendering, they were usually questioned briefly about the strengths and disposition of their units and searched for maps, letters from home or diaries, or any document that might provide clues. Before being sent to a permanent camp, certain prisoners, especially airmen, submarine crews, high-ranking officers, were taken to a special interrogation center that was common to the POW processing systems of all major powers. There, trained interrogators sought data about weapons and units and the enemy's economy and morale. When being interrogated, the interrogator might employ various methods ranging from psychological subterfuge to physical violence. Representatives of every major power probably resorted to physical abuse at one point or another. The Japanese were especially cruel during questioning. They used beating, bayoneting, and forcing bamboo splinters under the fingernails of their prisoners. If prisoners talked, even about the weather, they were rewarded, perhaps with a pleasant dinner accompanied by wine. Prisoners who remained silent were usually sent back to solitary, where it was common practice by German guards to manipulate the temperature in the cell. One man describes it as cooled below freezing point and then brought to an unbreathable Turkish bathhouse heat.
When my dad first became a POW, and I think any POW that gets captured goes through days, weeks, sometimes maybe months of interrogation. And the interrogation that he went through was they put him in a little box, a 4x4 box, for, I think he was only in there for 7 days. But they bring him out and they ask him questions over questions and questions and questions, and the only thing he would answer was his name, rank, and serial number. They asked him about my mom, if he had any girlfriends, what the weather was like, what his favorite food was, if he had a car, asked him all sorts of real questions that we would think is kind of innocent and wouldn't think it'd be any problem to answer. But he only answered his name, rank, and serial number. After the week being in the box, they put him into a camp with officers, and of course, like most prisoners of war, they try to escape, so they dig tunnels.
Another story that he would tell about the days in the prisoner of war camp. Of course, they were only allowed to give their name, rank, and serial number. Though they were beaten, that's all they would give. To keep morale up, what they do is they try to build tunnels out of the POW camp. But what they didn't know until the very end, and after the camp was overrun, is that the Germans had sensors buried in the ground. So as the prisoner of wars were digging, the Germans always always knew exactly how far the tunnel would go. The German officers would go ahead and let the Americans dig those tunnels because it kept their morale up. And what they would do is when they got the tunnel close to the fence, the Germans would stumble upon it supposedly, find it, and make the Americans fill in the tunnels. But the Americans had many tunnels going at that time, so that the morale was always high. As they get closer and closer, they'd take the guys that were on the tunnel I was just discovered and put them on the other tunnel. People that escaped from his camp, 0. People that were shot dying to escape during the 14 months that he was there, 5. And out of the 5, 2 of them just went completely crazy from the lack of food and wanting to get home, and they tried to climb the barbed wire fence. What the Germans would do is let them climb almost all the way to the top. Then they would shoot them, and then they'd leave them there for days, just so the prisoner that were left there would have an example of what not to do.
The design of German camps emphasized prevention of escape. Sometimes the camps were prominent old fortresses with thick stone walls and narrow barred windows. Some prisoners were housed in converted schools or factories, substantial buildings that could be made almost escape-proof as a castle. Some camps were built especially to house POWs, with wooden barracks raised on pilings, which made digging of tunnels difficult to conceal from the special anti-escape inspectors. A double barrier of barbed wire up to 12 feet high surrounded the compound. At regular intervals around the barbed wire were security towers with searchlights and machine guns. Guards patrolled the perimeter of the camp and had orders to shoot anyone who crossed the warning line, a wire usually set 30 feet inside the fence. Patrols conducted surprise inspections of the barracks. In the fight to stay whole and sane, probably the greatest threat to a prisoner was the constant tedium of camp life. Even if he worked, he was still confronted with endless empty hours. To fill the void, POWs staged theatrical productions and concerts, turned out camp newspapers, and even set up barbed wire universities where prisoners could gain college credits. An American in a German camp could also play baseball with equipment provided by the YMCA.
Spent a lot of time playing cards and shooting dice, singing old songs from home, kind of remembering who was there and keeping their morale up.
Also, he used to play card games and toss coins for cigarettes, and that was the only thing they had was cigarettes. The only thing they had in the camp was cigarettes. And that's what they played for. That was the most important thing to them then.
A POW's main concern while a prisoner was to get enough to eat. The average Allied prisoner had lost about 35 to 45 pounds, mostly in the final months of captivity when bombing of roads kept Red Cross parcels from getting through. A prisoner in the hands of Great Britain or the United States usually ate better than he would at home, while a Russian in a German camp or any Allied prisoner in a Japanese camp would usually be put on a starvation diet of as little as 500 to 600 calories a day. A typical Allied prisoner in a German or Italian camp were about halfway between the two extremes. Though these rations were hardly enough, they were combined with the Red Cross parcels. A Red Cross parcel was about 10 inches square, 4.5 inches deep, and weighed approximately 11 pounds, and was a prisoner's most precious possession. It contained dried fruits, canned meats and fish, crackers, cheese, margarine, dried milk, and came with some extras such as jam, chocolate, cigarettes, and soap. Each American and Great Britain prisoner in Europe would receive one parcel a week. In addition, a prisoner in Germany was allowed to receive a parcel from his family every 2 months. The American Red Cross sent nearly 200,000 tons of food, clothing, and medicine. It is said that if laid end to end, it would reach from Chicago to Berlin.
When my brother and I were kids, we, like most kids, would get kind of spoiled rotten, and my dad would always tell us the only meat he had when he was a kid, when he was in prisoner of war camp, was bugs. They had bugs in everything. He'd have cereal with bugs, and that's the only protein that he had the entire time he was in camp for 14 months.
What happened was, as he was in the prisoner of war camp during those 14 months, the only food that he he got would be oatmeal. The only meat that they got would be the maggots or any other bugs that would get into the oatmeal. Many of the other prisoners couldn't take that. So he would get many portions, as others just said they wouldn't eat that.
As the war wound down, the prospects of peace was clouded for many prisoners by the fear that the ceasefire might bring them death instead of liberation. The months, weeks, and days before the ceasefire became a time of suspense. The last months before liberation were the worst. Their captivity for most of the 260,000 British and American prisoners of Hitler's crumbling Third Reich. As the Red Army converged from the east and British and United States forces from the west, prisoners were marched from camp to camp to keep inside Germany's diminishing domain. Allied planes bombed the roads and railways, making delivery of vital Red Cross parcels difficult, and sometimes killed or injured prisoners on the march. The very nearness of freedom was a torment. Hitler had ordered Germany's chief administrator of POWs to collect all British and United States Air Force from German camps and enclose them in downtown target areas of Berlin and other major cities. He believed that using prisoners as hostages would force the Allies to suspend bombing attacks. Like many of Hitler's orders in the final months of the war, this one was never put into effect. As April ended, liberation of prisoners in Western Germany by rapidly advancing U.S. and British forces proceeded smoothly. In the face of overwhelming Allied superiority, the Germans at camp after camp simply gave up, often without a fight, and the prisoners were safe and free at last. On May 8th, POWs were moved by the thousands to special reception camps in France and Belgium. They were now known officially as ramps, repatriated Allied military personnel. With their new category came inevitable processing, delousing, medical examination, endless forms to fill out, and doctors' orders to stick to a soft diet until their shrunken stomachs could adjust to 3 meals a day. Liberated British and Commonwealth POWs were assembled in centers in France and Belgium and then sent to England. American ramps were collected in a large staging area called Camp Lucky Strike, where they had to wait to be shipped home. Lucky Strike was a vast tent city near the French port of Le Havre, and at one time in May, it bulged with some 48,000 former prisoners.
As the Germans were pulling back and getting closer and closer to Berlin to try to reinforce their troops, the Russians on the Eastern Front overran the Germans and actually freed them from their POW camp. But the Americans, 10,000 strong in this prisoner of war camp, wouldn't leave with the Russians. They waited for the Americans to come up. At that time, there was a big rush by everyone to get to Berlin and really end the war and get Hitler. After he was freed there in the war, in April, it probably took him 3 months as he went down to France to get rehabilitated and to get back over in the States, and he got back to the States about June 45. There was some thought that he might go over and join the war over in Japan at that time, so he went to Arizona to be trained, but in August, with the A-bomb droppings over in Japan, the war quickly ended there, so he didn't have to go. This letter was written May 21st, 1945. Dear folks, well, things are taking longer here than I had hoped. However, I am certain that I can be home by July 1st. I do not know what the Red Cross have told you to expect when we return, but I am certain I have not changed the slightest and do not wish to be treated any differently than when I left. As far as my health is concerned, it is as good as ever. I now weigh 160 pounds. That being normal, you can see I did not fare too badly. On April 30th, the Germans left our camp and took off for the American lines. The next day, the Russians arrived at Barth. It was then our fun began. The Russians looking and acting like a Mongol horde. Their clothes were made of anything they could find, and their equipment, except for a few American trucks and tanks,
was composed of horse-drawn artillery and wagons. It seemed impossible that such an army could possibly defeat the German war machine. It was done with inexhaustible men, which I suppose wins all battles. From May 1st to the 9th, we stayed at our camp, making trips to the nearby camps and towns in our area. When we were hungry, we would stop at a German house and demand being fed, or we would tell the nearest Russian and he would get us food. One boy asked a Russian for some meat. The Russian then shot a cow and cut off the rear leg and gave it to the boy. I do not imagine they are any different than they were 1,000 years ago. At times, we would feel sorry for the German people with the Russians overrunning their country, but quickly changed our sympathies when we visited a concentration camp a few miles away. Seeing the conditions, I can only say that it was much worse than the stories released about others. On May 9th, we were flown by our B-17s to Lyon, France, and from there we traveled to St. Valery by rail. I converted some of the items I had to 1,500 francs, about $30, and had a wonderful time converting the francs into drinks at the different cafes along the road. Although I was never very sharp in French in school, I now feel that I can carry on enough to make myself understood. This makes the trip so much more enjoyable. One morning I went to a French farmhouse and asked for breakfast. They fixed up scrambled eggs, ham and bread. I supplied the coffee and we had a great time talking things over. I am now at Camp Lucky Strike near St. Valery, awaiting transportation home. At night I leave the base making the rounds of the cafes, but I am most careful in my selection of drinks and have not been high as yet. When I return, I expect a 60-day furlough. It sounds too good to be true. We were all quite worried during March of this year. Orders came out to shoot all of us. They instead fed us on a starvation rations. 1/7 of a loaf of black bread and thin potato soup. However, in April, they again gave us the Red Cross packages, so since then we have fared well. When the Russians arrived, they drove 1,000 cows and 1,000 pigs into our camp. We butchered them and had our fill of steaks and hamburgers. Since arriving at this camp, I have been more hungry than any time but March. They are under the impression that we have been starved, and as a result, we are on a soft diet of chicken to enlarge our stomachs. In order to get enough to eat, we have to obtain food from the farmers nearby. It has just started to rain, but then again it is raining off and on ever since we arrived dans la Belle France. I have not received letters from home since January 3rd, and it will be impossible for me to get any before my return. I trust you are all well and will remain in good health for this glorious reunion. Lots of love to you all.
This video was dedicated to Robert Nixon Evans.